Hey everyone! In our last section, you might remember that we learned about how Rome was founded and how geography shaped Roman culture. And we also learned about what other cultures, like the Etruscans and the Greeks, influenced the development of Roman thought, writing, ideas about government, and military strategies. We also talked about how the plebeians, otherwise known as the common folk, people like us, eventually got some voice in government and obtained some rights. We also talked a bit about how Roman law developed. For example, the 12 tables that were displayed in public forums that stated what the laws were. We also talked about how the Romans began expanding their territory and trying to take control of the whole Mediterranean. Remember, they fought wars called the Punic Wars with a very powerful city called Carthage. And the goal was to try to establish hegemony or dominance over the whole Mediterranean. And the Romans were successful in doing this. They won. Well, now we're going to turn to the effects of Roman expansion on Rome itself. Because once you expand your territory, you have to direct a lot of your resources towards running your empire. And often when empires or nations are so focused on running things over there, stuff begins to break down at home. And that's exactly what happened to the Romans. The more they expanded, the more the problems at home, that is in Rome, grew worse and ultimately culminated in civil war. Okay, so what kind of domestic problems were the Romans having? Well, lots. For one thing, there were class tensions, which means frustration and anger between the rich and the poor and all the people somewhere in the middle. The rich, also called the patricians, didn't want to give up any of their rights or their control of society. And the plebeians, the common people, were fighting for a voice in government and for laws that would protect them. Another problem was that slavery was the foundation of the Roman economy. That means the Romans were heavily dependent on slave labor, and there were a lot of slaves. They made up about a third of the population, which made the Romans a bit nervous because, well, slaves can revolt and they can cause a lot of trouble. A third problem was that these large estates, owned by very wealthy aristocrats, were putting the small guys out of business. Just like the mom and pop stores have been replaced by the Walmarts, Targets, and Amazon.coms in most places in America, small farmers in the Roman Republic couldn't compete with those big estate owners, and they were not happy. The large estates were called latifundia, and we'll talk about this later in more depth. So a changing society, especially one that's changing too quickly and radically, can certainly shake things up. A lot of people who were small farmers and had other small jobs ended up unemployed and homeless. And we're going to talk about a few guys who were brothers who tried to fix some of these problems. So these two guys who tried to fix some of the problems were called the Gracchus brothers. They were called, the oldest brother was Tiberius and the younger brother was Gaius. And Tiberius was kind of like Robin Hood. He was trying to take land from the rich to give it to the poor. And actually, both the Gracchus brothers came from wealthy aristocratic backgrounds, but they were trying to fix some of the problems that were going on in Roman society. So he is not appreciated and he ends up getting murdered. And then his brother Gaius kind of picks up the torch and tries to follow in his brother's footsteps, tries to make other reforms, but he ends up committing suicide because he knew they were about to come after him for the reforms that he had introduced. And all of this leads to civil war. So all of this instability in society also leads to a military breakdown. So generals start seizing power by force and hiring mercenaries who are loyal only to them. And what happens is in the Roman Republic at this point, there, there was too much power in the hands of individual generals. And so this period of military rule, men who seized power by force and hired soldiers loyal only to them, basically paves the way for Julius Caesar. Okay, so Julius Caesar is a general in the Roman army who uses his military power to gain political power. He's a great leader. He's able to act decisively, make quick decisions. He moved his troops rapidly. He had a great rapport with his men, and he joins this another military hero called Pompey and another guy named Crassus, who was just a rich man, and they form something that they call the First Triumvirate. And Caesar is pushing the territory even further. He wants to conquer more territory, and so he looks to Gaul, which is modern day France, as we learned. And so he conquers the Celts, the people of Gaul. They were this barbarian tribe that had settled they had moved down from Spain to France, as well as to Great Britain. And these guys were the ones that were depicted as the kind of weird druids in that cartoon movie that we saw the other day. And so he goes in and he essentially conquers the Gauls, the Celts who were living in Gaul, and he extends Rome's borders even further. But by 53 BC, the triumvirate had essentially fallen apart. Crassus, the rich guy, had died in a military campaign in the east, and the other two, Julius Caesar and Pompey, were not, well, let's just say they didn't get along very well. Basically, Pompey married Julius Caesar's daughter, Julia, and she ended up dying in 54 BC, and they were not the best of friends. So Pompey actually forms an alliance with the Senate, and the Senate is really jealous of Julius Caesar because he's popular, he's really powerful, and they also see that he's power hungry, so he wants more and more. And so basically, the Senate demands that Julius Caesar relinquish his troops and return home. And on January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar defies these orders and crosses the Rubicon River, that river that runs through Rome. And by doing so, he's effectively declaring war on the Senate. Okay, so let's try to get our minds around this idea of Caesar crossing the Rubicon. Basically, an ancient Roman law forbade any general from crossing the Rubicon River and entering Italy, or the Italy proper, with a standing army. To do so was considered treason. This tiny stream would reveal Caesar's intentions and mark the point of no return for Caesar. So by crossing the Rubicon, he had sealed his fate. And so today you'll sometimes hear the expression, so-and-so crossed the Rubicon in his life, and that pretty much means that he made a decision that went past the point of any return and sealed his fate. So Caesar defeats his enemies, sets himself up as dictator, and the Senate is basically forced to support him because he's so popular with the people. And he rules for 5 years this way and makes moderate reforms. So he lowers taxes, he makes governors responsible to him, he keeps a check on all the businessmen so they can't drain the wealth of Rome's provinces. He starts a bunch of public works projects to provide jobs for the poor, to beautify the city. He reforms the courts. He extends Roman citizenship outside of Italy, which also was very attractive to the peoples that Rome was conquering. And so it actually helped to unite Roman territory. But Julius Caesar is mainly interested in increasing his own power. And so, again, the Senate fears him and murders him on the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC. You guys know from the Julius Caesar, famous play Julius Caesar by Shakespeare, beware the Ides of March. So, the murdering of Julius Caesar doesn't really solve the problems. It doesn't restore the Republic, which is, which died out after the Civil War. But it does plunge Rome into a renewed civil war, and a lot more people, thousands more actually, die in battle. And this is where we will pick up in the next lesson.